Hello, everybody. We're going to try to get through this as quickly as we can. And I'm also going to try to make sure you understand the concepts of social interaction as we live, work, and interact with each other. We all have roles. The experience of being a person who occupies a role is something that's nothing new to you. All of us play these roles. I've talked about that in the past. But as we look at these examples, I want you to have something in your mind about what they look like. For example, when I say governor, or soccer mom, priest, electrician, athlete, girl. All of these have particular pictures in your head because social interaction has created roles where people have learned that those roles have certain expectations. They also may have some gendered identities that, as we talk about gender in later chapters, we'll start to identify. Each role carries with it a different status. That's a social honor or prestige that's particular to a group, and it's given by society. For example, the role and status of a president. Now, when we say the word president, we often mean of a country or somebody that has high status, maybe president of a company. But president of a car club doesn't seem to have as high of a status. So socially, we honor this role of president differently based on the role and the expectations of it. So status is not always associated with wealth or ownership. For example, think about the principal in your town that most affected the community. Were they the richest person in town? Or the fire chief, school board member? Now, you probably didn't have the Dalai Lama in your own town, but you probably can understand that this person who has taken a vow of poverty is actually very influential and has high status in society. All our roles interact and we change our roles accordingly. Impression management, coined by Erving Goffman, who is our quote of the day, is the preparing presentation of one's social role, meaning that stage that we are on, we're always preparing that role. Social interaction, then, is the process by which we act and react to those around us. In fact, it's the stage underneath that we are on, but we share that interaction with others on that stage. Sometimes we're very close in proximity and in relationship, and sometimes we are just acquaintances. Additionally, we also share our levels of agency, the ability to think, act, and make choices independently. Agency is something that you have very little of when you're born, but when you grow and be mature, and especially in the United States over the age of 21, you're given more agency. Under the age of 21, you're still restricted from a lot of societal roles and abilities to make choices that are not against the law, for example, purchasing alcohol. Erving Goffman coined not only impression management, but also the dramaturgical model, which is the overall scope of this theory. As mentioned in earlier classes, it takes the view that all the world's a stage and that there are many stages that we also find ourselves performing in different roles and in different ways. So therefore, we are always performers. Goffman thought it was important to study social interaction in sociology because of three major reasons. One, our day-to-day routines tell us about the structure of society and how we formed what we do. It also reveals how humans can creatively shape reality, meaning we have some really interesting ways, for example, putting together road systems with automobiles, being able to fly, to get to different parts of the world. We take for granted all of these high technology and high industrial technologies that may employ us for the rest of our life, and we see them as just something we do. 200 years ago, if an automobile and the road systems were the way that we experience them today, and or if they saw a plane in the sky, that would shake their reality. And so we have to keep in mind that we just take a lot of this for granted, and it shows in our interactions. Finally, it sheds light on a larger social system and the institutions in which we agree have authority. We may not agree with the systems, but we tend to live into them. For example, getting an education, finding a job, buying a home, being a person that is found with more responsibility as they age. Take a moment to listen to this video on impression management and the explanation of Irving Goffman's dramaturgical model. We also communicate without words. Body language, communication between individuals based on facial expression and gestures rather than language can say a lot. For example, if I were to raise my hand and just have my middle finger and the rest of them down, how would you respond? That is a symbol in the United States for flipping somebody off, meaning I really don't like you or I think you're an a-hole. These are things that we have to pay attention to. In other parts of the world, doing this gesture would have no meaning whatsoever. But there may be other gestures that you have to watch out for, especially if you're used to one that you think is simple and easy and has no connotation to it whatsoever. It may be very offensive in another part of the world. Facial expressions are also something that give away what we're saying, and also sometimes what's behind the mask if we're surprised. For example, let's look at the next facial expressions. This guy, disgusted. He can't believe what he's seeing. He may not have wanted to have that reaction right away, but that's the exact reaction that came out on his mask, and his front stage is presenting what's going on inside. When we see somebody cry, we know they're sad, or when their mouth is agape and there's eyes that are wide open, they're surprised or scared. When a person is angry, we can usually tell by the brow and the way it comes down, and also the way the eyes are intense. Whereas when somebody's happy, we can see our smile that takes over our whole face. We almost glow like this young person. We've also created an interaction of emotions through emojis, and it expresses our agency of what it is, what's going on that we are wanting other people to feel, or we also receive it that way. For example, to the left is this little smoochie, and the smoochie can feel very different coming from your mom versus coming from somebody that you're attracted to. On the right, you may be saying to somebody, hey, that's cheesy, or meh, or whatever you give that emotion. Over time, as people see these different emojis, they get to an identity, or put a social identity to what you're saying. If you use these emotions, like, hey, I'm cool, you may feel like you're either giving yourself a little prop on the back, or you're really being funny. And also you may be reacting to somebody that has a lot of funny in them. They're making you laugh, and so you do the LOL. Sometimes we take symbols in society and create something completely different. This symbol actually started off as the top of an ice cream cone and its chocolate flavor, but we tend to use it when we're feeling not so great, or we think the world is just a bunch of poo. Gestures are intended. They may have different meanings in different places, so we have to be aware, as I said, with those gestures. For example, things that could be offensive. But we can also do other things like nod, shrug, tell people off, wave, and they can have a positive impact, but also tell people a lot about what we're meaning or feeling. Our social roles are defined expectations, and the individual is given a status, and they occupy that particular social position. For example, a few years back during the Super Bowl, Peyton Manning was expected to feel patriotic and supportive of his team, a long-time effort to get this award. And so he had the social role of being the head quarterback, and that's what an athlete does, is they take on that proud position for a national title. Whereas Beyonce was the halftime entertainment. And at that time, there had been many shootings, including people of color who had been shot by police officers. And in response, she dressed up as a Black Panther, and you saw a straight look on her face. Her facial expression is intense and angry and or protesting. And her role as an entertainer, we expected that, especially when something is happening on a national level. Our entertainers are expected to take on that role. However, as we see those roles be challenged over time, sometimes we see structures that try to keep those roles in place. A structure is a recurrent pattern of arrangements, hierarchies, influence, what we expect basically out of our larger social systems. So for example, if Peyton Manning during that Super Bowl had been part of the Black Lives Matter movement and was the first person to kneel during the national anthem in protest and looking for social equality, people would have thought that he was going against the structure, and it would have looked differently, as we're seeing athletes today being sanctioned for that. The same is true as if Beyonce was super patriotic, and as a performer, she had been expected to take on a voice of protest, but instead just ignored the issue and did a happy little routine in the middle. Her structure of being an entertainer also involves that sense of having a voice through this entertainment industry. We need to think about those family structures, school structures, work structures, and leisure structures, meaning how we take time off, and know how they're kind of prescribed by what society deems as socially acceptable. A social position is a social identity an individual is given by a group or society. Social positions may be general in nature, but they also can be more specific. For example, that identity of a person that is president of the United States has a certain attitude that's expected with it. Also, there's a certain attitude expected with father or a CEO of a company. Now, the interesting thing is that although the president may be a CEO and a father, that different roles of that will be seen based on the position, probably the highest being president, CEO of a company next, and father, even though we have an entire holiday deemed for that, we at the same time don't give that person as much status as if they were a president of a country. The social self is the basic self-consciousness in human individuals, the self that you are conferred upon by the reactions of others as you do things either positively or negatively. In their opinion, you will have sanctions and rewards that come with that. The other thing is, as a young person, you will never know how many of those roles have been put upon you at an early age where you had no agency in which to refute those roles. And so by the time you get to a certain age, you're thought of as an athlete or based on your masculinity or femininity. You might be considered smart. You may be considered somebody that's truant. And that social self is a role that you take on. As you age, you might become more self-conscious. And in college, we see this happen a lot, where you're aware of that social identity that has been prescribed upon yourself and the reactions that others had, and you decide to do something different. Or you decide to keep it. You're just aware that others have basically made that sense of role on you. You can also become self-conscious when you live outside of a role and people are paying more attention to that change. And as you make those changes, people may or may not agree with your new self. When we're in society, we interact differently as well. Civil intention is when we are aware that we're with large groups of people, often in cities or large arenas, that we're aware of their presence and we have certain actions. We try to avoid running into them. If we're going across the street, we all go across at the same time when the light changes. And we see people who are in vehicles try to avoid hitting us. At least that's what we'd like. Civil intention is when we're aware of those around us, but we're not really in relationship with them. Please excuse my puppy, by the way, who is playing in the background. Unfocused interaction is more like when you're in a crowd, an arena, or going to a concert. And while you're there, you're engaged in all this interaction with others, but not directly face-to-face. In fact, you may be in a room with another person that you've never known, and if you later came to see each other and talked about being at the same concert, you could share in the same interaction. You had the same interaction. It was just unfocused on each other. It was focused on the band. Focused interaction is when individuals engage in common activity through direct conversation. This can happen with friends, family, those who you're close to, but it can also happen with others that you're very intent on listening to. For example, an interview and an interviewer and an interviewee are paying attention to each other very clearly. It's just basically that you're focused on the other. An encounter might be a place where you set up a time, maybe with a friend, maybe for a date, maybe just to go out with family, but it's also a time that you might set up for an interview or set up for a place. It's just that it has time constraining it and that you're both intent on being face-to-face in an interaction. Let's take an example of what goes on when you have many interactions with the space of a local bar that serves burgers that you like. And you and your friend decide to take a break. You go to the bar and you get in a booth. You're focused on focused interaction with each other. You may do audience segregation, though, when someone comes up, say it's your mom's best friend, and says hi while you're in the bar eating a burger. Now, you may be underage and not able to drink at the bar, but it may feel like you're self-conscious that your mom's best friend is seeing you in a bar with another person, and that might cause you to act a little differently with that person. You're still focused on that interaction, but you take on a different role as daughter, not as friend, like you are with your friend in the booth. Now let's say the band starts to play. And as the band starts to play, people start dancing and paying attention to the music, and it plays your favorite song. You start to be part of that music experience, even just by knowing that you're an audience member, you're listening to a band and a fan. You may also have a person in the room that you are not aware of that maybe the next day you run into, and they also had listened to the band and you shared in that interaction. So you weren't friends, you weren't focused on interaction, but you take on the role of being a fan together. This is all called audience segregation, where you take on the different roles all at the same time. Interactional vandalism would be something like if you're sitting in that same booth, your mom's friend is talking to you, the band's going on, and this total stranger out of the blue comes and sits in the booth next to you and starts to interrupt the conversation. Maybe they're drunk. And that will be totally breaking of that conversation and that interaction. And so in the process of that, you experience the vandalism of what you're expecting. Trolling, catcalling, this also is interactional vandalism. My dog is doing interactional vandalism right now with a squeaky toy. So we'll just let him do that as he's bored on a snow day. Personal space is something we're not often aware of until somebody has crossed the boundary. Eye contact can be different with a person that you know well versus a person that you don't know at all. Touching has certain levels depending on how close you are, and speaking even has certain identities of whether or not the role is appropriate. If a person that is your teacher talks to you in a way that feels too sexual, whereas a person that you're interested in, that is a fellow student, that has a different sense of personal space. Compulsion of proximity is where we need to interact with others in presence, but we're always aware of that difference. And so women and men often are very aware of their different genders. People of different skin tones are sometimes aware of their different experiences, and that's societally put onto us by those social roles that we're often taken in with that social identity, because basically societies make these different categorizations, and we'll talk about that later on stratification. One thing that we often do in sociology to test what's going on within an interaction is a breaching experiment. It's intentionally breaking social rules in order to study the reactions and actions of those being studied. And so when we do this, we allow ourselves to see that people have very set rules, structures, roles, statuses, and when they're broken with basically that interaction vandalism, we see reactions that are important that tell us about those structures. For example, that person that may have moved into the booth on you and maybe got too close, you might have a response cry, an exclamation saying, "Hey, get out of the booth," or something like, "You're being a real jerk." These are types of things that we do. They're just outward expressions. But really the big ones are things like, "Oops, oh my gosh, wow, holy whatever." These are response cries. Finally, everything we do is involved in a time space. When we study interactions, they happen during certain times that we can record. We have a 24-hour system around the world for a day based on light and darkness, how we do our work, when we sleep, when we have leisure time. Each society may have a little different level of what the amount of work is and the amount of leisure time. However, the same event of paying attention to the time in which these things are happening is important. So it's when and where events occur. Each region may have different experiences of social life. If you're in a different time zone, Regionalization may also help us to know that winter happens in a different season during the month in the southern hemisphere versus the northern hemisphere. Finally, you may be wanting this to be wrapped up and saying, hey, I've paid attention, there's enough time for this lecture today, and we call that clock time. And I'm very aware of that, as this is the last slide. Time's measured by the clock. We have hours, minutes, and seconds everywhere around the world. This is a common measurement that we all use. This clock time is how we also recognize the structure of our 24-hour day, or 7 days a week, and how we, as a society, do all these interactions in those times. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next Tuesday.